Thank you, friends. Nice to be here. Well, there really was quite a separation between the two. I was very interested in teaching English literature, and I think that led to an interest in language primarily. And then when I started working overseas, I became more and more interested in language and realized that it was the doorway to perception for everybody, and that different languages led to different kinds of perception. My wife, Beryl, and I first went to Africa in 1958. And we went just to look and to see, as many people had at that time. This was before independence for most of the countries. We went to Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda. Went to Kenya and Tanzania at that time only. I was interested in wildlife. I was interested in national parks. I was interested in the conservation of wildlife. But it didn't take me very long traveling there and then going back to work there finally in 1961, it didn't take me long to realize that it was the Africans themselves that would make the difference in the survival of the wildlife, and that just setting up parks wasn't enough. The countries that were becoming independent really had to value that wildlife themselves rather than having that value superimposed on them by others. Right. So this meant that there was a real need. There were no Swahili language documentaries for African audiences, and there certainly weren't theaters out in the bush. I had to learn how to run a mobile film unit and make the films and then take them out and show them to the audiences at nighttime. And I would go out on some occasions and I'd go to a little village and announce that I was going to show a film that night, and I would get maybe 1,000 people with spears and shields all show up. And it became a social occasion for the people, and they loved it. And they were listening to their own language. They were having other Africans talk to them about wildlife and its importance economically to the country and so forth. So that was great fun. Well, many of them seeing photographs for the first time, and that was a whole subject that I got very interested in, is how did pre-literate people who could neither read nor write, how did they look at pictures, 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface? And I ran into a remarkable man with the Flying Doctor's Service who'd been out there for 30 or 40 years, named Alan Holmes. And Alan had done a lot of work on the perception of objects in pictures by African audiences, African viewers. And he found that very few people could see 3-dimensionally on a 2-dimensional surface. And he had come to the conclusion that this was a learned perceptual process, something we had to learn how to do. And it seems to be very closely related to the capacity to read by looking at a page and focusing not on the individual words on the page, but focusing slightly in front of the page so that you can scan quite a large part of the page at one time. That this leads to a facility with looking at pictures that's different from people who can't do it. There certainly were instances where people that I showed pictures to couldn't really figure out what you were doing. But they could get oriented by sound to what was happening on the screen, to the lion roaring or a person talking to them. And then they would gradually fill in the bits and pieces and begin to learn how to do this. Oh, the changes have been dramatic. I first went to Nepal in 1972 and went back another 8 or 9 times, and was most recently there only a year ago or so. I would say that one of the great changes has been, of course, increase in population, increase in technology in terms of automobiles, and the pollution of the Kathmandu Valley by those automobiles and poorly refined gasoline. Then the sudden explosion of video cassette recorders, video rental shops, videotape rentals, where people are seeing Sylvester Stallone films without having any cultural preparation for looking at something like this. And then one would see the proliferation of rooftop antennas for picking up CNN, all the American soap operas, again with no cultural preparation for any of this. So that the jarring of these cultures is tremendous, these 2 different ways of looking at reality. And so you find, on the one hand, many American people, many women, American women, going to Nepal to go trekking, as they would call it. But they're going there not just to go trekking, they're going there because they found something here lacking in this culture. And they go to a Hindu or Buddhist culture and maybe find a guru, a teacher, or maybe an ashram, a place they can go and study. And they find that an appealing world. And yet the very people from that culture would throw all that aside, the young people particularly, to get to Walmart and Disneyland. So you find many people from Europe and America who want to go to Asia for the psychological, the spiritual fulfillment. You find many of them wanting to come here for the material gain, and nobody is talking to each other. Gosh, that's a good question and a hard one to deal with in a very short space. I think that there is such a separation that has taken place in the last 300 years in the Western world that really began with Descartes and the idea that there were the things of the mind and then there was the real world, that these are quite separate from each other. I would argue that they're not as separate as we think, that there is a tremendous interrelationship between us and our surroundings. The ecologists talk about it in a physical sense, but I think I'm talking about it in a psychological sense. Our language is like a template that we superimpose on sense experience. And we superimpose a template that requires that we break our sensations, our physical sensations, down into nouns or verbs before we can start communicating with each other. And when you break the world doesn't know anything about this kind of breaking the world up into nouns and verbs. Right. It's only humans that know about that. And it acts, as I said, like a template that we superimpose on nature. And we try, we come away feeling still separate from it without realizing that what we see out there is very much a process of what's going on in our minds inside, and that there's a dance between the inside and the outside, not a separation. And certainly I think in terms of what we call nature, we are as much a part of that in our minds as we are in our bodies and our breathing and all of the organic structure of the human being, like an organism in nature. We are part of nature in ways that we really don't understand at all. When we walk in the woods, we say, "Oh, I hear a crow." If we stop and think about it a little bit, our ears don't hear crows, our ears hear sound. It's the mind that's doing the crow stuff. So that the mind and the crow have there's a real affinity here, that by previous experience, the new sound that we hear on Tuesday and what we heard last week, we can say that's a crow because we can make some sort of comparison by the sound that we hear and the meaning of that sound. We don't smell coffee cooking. We smell, we have an olfactory experience, and our mind is doing the coffee part of it. This was written about an experience I had in the Canyon de Chelly, which is a Navajo area, part of the National Park Service. I spent a week walking through Canyon de Chelly with a number of elderly Navajo people. At night before we went to sleep under the stars, a Navajo storyteller recounted one of the many tales of first man and first woman. As all such tales, it began with the words, "Once upon a time," and we were led once again through that familiar doorway into timelessness and to the story of how children were first given to the human race. To return from that world to the one of airports and rental cars is not an altogether negative experience, because for a short moment, one is privileged to be poised between two worlds, occupying neither, and briefly one's perception of both is heightened. What sets those worlds apart from me is the way in which time is measured in each. The Navajos live immersed in slower rhythms, in time that's measured by a shadow's change as on a sundial, or by falling sand as in an hourglass. In such measurements, one may read in a single view what has been, what is, and what is yet to come. In our world, the measurement of time is digital, on clocks that have lost the simple humanness of face and hands, on clocks that speak only of what is now, in which there is no past that's visible, and the future too is unseen. I think the only way we can nurture that capacity is by having alternative experiences. One of what I would call the basic correlatives of environmental perception is that it's impossible to perceive any environment except from the context of another one. So when St. Paul says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, that's not a statement a child could make. You have to become the adult in order to appreciate what youth is all about. And that kind of perspective is what takes place when the Peace Corps volunteer goes from Akron, Ohio, to work as a forest manager in Mali in West Africa. That young person, male or female, can never look at Akron, Ohio again the same way. In other words, they become more conscious because they've got something to compare everything to. Meaning comes through comparison. It's the only way it comes. So when they go off to some foreign place and come back, somebody says, what was it like? Wanting a comparison between the familiar and the unfamiliar so that they can gain greater understanding. It's very difficult to increase consciousness, but it's crucial to us as a species. The habit of our thinking is that metaphor is a kind of frill of language. It's something that Shakespeare sort of did. And it isn't something that we take seriously. It's fancy writing. But I would suggest that all language is basically metaphorical. When I go up and climb Camel's Hump, and I come back to Burlington and meet a friend, I try to put into words what was not a verbal experience, the climbing of the mountain. So that, if you will, the verbal experience is a kind of comparison of the nonverbal experience of climbing the mountain. They're not the same thing at all. And we give prizes to writers who are able to recount a sense experience particularly well. This comparison is where the meaning comes. So metaphor is how we compare one thing with another in order to increase meaning. So when Shakespeare says, like as the waves move toward the pebbled beach, so do our minutes hasten to their end, he's making a comparison between this rhythm that we're familiar with in the ocean and looking at it in terms of a human life or time to increase our understanding of the process. I think it had a tremendous effect, and the concept of la naturaleza as being feminine and like language like Spanish is so polarized between the masculine and the feminine. Of everything is either el or la, broken up into this way. A lot of it is at totally unconscious level, but it's built into the way the world is looked at. My feeling was that if much of the land of let's say Honduras, where I was working at the time, much of that land is owned by the military or owned by businessmen, and they cut the forest down and they're exploiting the land and making it difficult for tenant farmers to get a subsistence living because of the payment owed to the landowner. This is a form of exploitation in a way. And my feeling was that if you began to look at nature not as an object for exploitation, the way much feminine stuff was exploited, that the idea of nature as la madre, as the mother, the nourisher, and also because of the strong associations with the Catholic religion and the Virgin Mary, all of these elements would make a difference. As in an education program, when you started calling nature, instead of la naturaleza, call it la madre. It's hard to answer that. Obviously, we could test the earth by putting an awful lot more people on it than we have now, and I'm sure it would support them. But what changes is the quality of life so much. I mean, if you figure that in about every 60 hours, the world increases by the entire population of the state of Vermont by 606,000 people, something like that, every 60 hours. It's very hard to imagine quality being preserved for any length of time. Quality of education, quality of diet, quality of medical care. I worked I've worked in places in India, for instance, where after 30 days there, I realized that the population, while I was there for 30 days, it had increased by 1.5 million people. And these people, how can you run bus system, food system, educational systems for that kind of increase? You can't do it indefinitely. I think it's the way you go about it that makes a difference. I think if you're going in there with the idea that we know best, or something like that, when we really don't know best, I think we're better off if we go in with a certain kind of humility that really says, well, let's sit down and look at the problem together and see if there's some way we can work out a solution to that problem. The people are terribly anxious and willing to be helpful and supportive if they don't feel threatened by someone superimposing a value system on top of them. I think I want them to be courageous enough to take risks, to do the thing which is a little threatening, because they will grow as people from that experience. And I think that's what I really am concerned about, is their own budding consciousness of themselves and awareness of their own capacity to do things and accomplish things. And once they've done a Peace Corps stint or taken a semester abroad, they come home and they walk taller and they have more confidence, they behave totally differently. I think self-awareness can be confused with self-centeredness. I'm certainly not advocating that. The idea of trying to get outside ourselves to find out who we are by comparison is what's essential. To go to a culture that looks at many things differently than from the way we do. We are being forced to do this with the Muslim religion now. We're being forced to do this with the presence of considerable amount of Buddhist emphasis or concern in this country. And some of our old values are being questioned, and many people find it threatening, very threatening. I think younger people don't find it quite so threatening as older people do. And I think this is one of the clashes between generations because of the threat of change. We've got to change if we're going to survive as a species. And the young people are really the vanguard of that whole thing. I think many of them are. I've had certainly maybe 150 students at UVM who've gone either for a semester abroad and then come back and gone into Peace Corps after graduation. And I think they're never the same again. And they write me and say, thank you for urging me to do this. And they're the ones who did it. That's the important thing. And I think their awareness of what they're capable of increases, and that's a marvelous kind of self-confidence. Oh, goodness, that's a difficult question.
I'm sure.
Many.
Yeah.
Lauren Isley, who was, I think, Benjamin Franklin Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, I think, many years ago. He was a major influence on me as a young person. Great many poets. E. Cummings was a great influence. Robert Frost was a great influence. But intellectually, I'd find one of the most stimulating people is a very, not well known at all, died not very many years ago, a man named Owen Barfield from England. Wrote a handful of books, and those books, I think, were revolutionary and still are. I don't know. I'm working on some things right now to do with how we see by comparison, and I want to do a book called The Metaphoric Mind, and that's what I'm working on at the moment.